The other side of GUI development is handling the events that come along with it. Now, we're staying real basic with this. We're not going to get super involved. We're not going to deal with all the things you could possibly do. The most likely things you're going to want to do is basically respond to button clicks. But all of these things that you see here are things that could be happening inside of an event. And so, as we mentioned before, we start with this AWT event concept. It's the Abstract Windowing Toolkit. It was the first thing that came along. And inside of here, there's a bunch of different things that could happen based off of the different components that are in there. I don't just listen to random things. I listen for things on a specific object. So let's say I have a button out there. On that button, I could be listening for something such as it being clicked, which would be like a mouse event inside of there, an input event that would be happening inside of here. That's way down in the hierarchy here, this inheritance hierarchy that we're showing here. And so we can say, okay, well, when the mouse clicked, what happened inside of there? Really, those mostly, though, aren't based off of the individual mouse. We don't want it that abstract. We don't care if I clicked in the top left corner of the button, or the bottom right corner of the button. I just clear the button was clicked. And so that's more likely to be represented as an action event, up here in the top left corner. So you need to understand that this hierarchy allows you to do both. And I could listen to the same sort of thing happening on either one. The question is, how is it triggered? Because if you think of a button, yes, I can click on a button, but often in a GUI I can tab through items on a screen and get to a button and hit the space bar or the enter key, and that will also activate the button. So being aware of where these things lie and what they do and picking the right event is really critical towards our design of this hierarchy. Some of them will work, but they might have side effects that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. So largely we're going to be looking at action events, the things that happen when I click on a button. Now let's say you wanted to deal with a person typing into a text box. You want to validate as they type or something like that. Well, then you can get into text events. And you can assign what's called a listener to a specific text box and listen for what they're typing inside of there. That's really advanced GUI development. Not anything you're necessarily going to want to do right now, but it is possible. Anything the user does, you can do it that way. But you could also do the same thing through a key event, saying which key was pressed. If you say, I never want to allow the user to type in numbers, if they press a key and it was a number, then I just ignore that. I just somehow pop up an error message or whatever I'm supposed to be designed to do inside of there. That's a very heavy-handed approach, but sometimes necessary. Sometimes I want to control at that level. If I'm writing a video game, I really do need to know raw key events and mouse events, and I need to respond to them immediately. Where if I'm letting people type, I can let them type, hit a save button, and then respond to it in a validation sense. And we'll look at that as well inside of the sequence of talking about GUI development. How do we validate text that comes up and different elements that comes up. So being aware of this hierarchy is important, and choosing the actions appropriately within this hierarchy is important as you go through and design, just being aware that mostly we need to deal with action events, as we're going to see when we get to coding. Now, for any of those events, the way we handle it is through a listener. And a listener is basically like saying, hey, I have this contract. Well, you can think of it this way. I've signed up for text messaging. And so anytime somebody famous walks in the room, text me and say, this person walked in the room. Give me a little details. Not just a famous person showed up, but who was it? What's their name? It's the paparazzi listener, if you will. So my listener class is for that specific purpose. I need to adhere to some specific requirement. And so in this case, we have a listener that is implementing the action listener. I'm looking for things like button presses, and there's other things that action listeners can be besides for button presses. But that's the beauty of the listener hierarchy, is it's not just specifically to one type of thing. It's anything that can realize this. And so when an action is performed, I receive an action event, which gives me some details about the action. And so I have to provide this method, action performed, with no return type and taking in a parameter of action event in order to respond to it. And so this is just simply telling me that this thing happened. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to do anything with it. It doesn't really necessarily interrupt the flow of what's happening unless I specifically do something to interrupt that flow. And in this case, when somebody presses a button, I pop up a message dialog saying, you pressed a button. This is very simple. This is not a formula in itself to solve a problem. It's a tool to let you do it. It's a pry bar. It's a screwdriver. It's not instructions to build something. It's just the tool that lets you get along those lines. So in order to apply that listener, I've got to go to some element, in this case the button, as I said. And when I create the button, I do that separately. And when I add the button to the screen, I do that separately. And then somewhere behind the scenes, I add my listener. And that's where I'm adding in, so I have the button, I add the button to the screen, and I add in my new pop-up listener. That's the class I have down here. And then our pop-up listener is going to respond anytime the button is pressed from that point forward. And so by adding in the action listener, and then you can have any number of action listeners. There's just a big list of them, and any of them you can add. I can have 10 different things that happen. I don't have all of my actions to happen at once. I can have 3 or 4 different types of things that happen when a button's pressed, and apply them or not apply them to a button as desired. So as we go forward to build this stuff, there's 2 ways we can go and build this. We're going to see in class some examples of building this stuff using the NetBeans GUI builder. And that's going to simplify a lot of this work for us. It will actually create all the plumbing and just give us a method to say, hey, put your response inside of here. And so when we create using the GUI builder, we're going to drag and drop elements onto a screen. It's going to put them in a special layout manager, one that we haven't talked about because it's really built just for GUI development like this, that will space things appropriately and that'll move things around appropriately as the screen resizes. So we place them with our mouse, and then we can double click on certain items, and that'll add action listeners to them, it'll add text listeners to them, things like that. And then we can go through and code in the behaviors. When we press a button, double click it, it'll have that happen. We'll see that as we go into class and see some demos, and there's some example videos of that we'll see as well. The other alternative is we can go through and code by hand. We can literally, every line of code that the GUI builder would build, we can code ourselves. We don't need fancy tools. We can do it with a text editor and a compiler and do it all command line. And I've done it like that before because there's nothing in Java that's hidden. There's nothing that needs a bunch of extra tools over the top of it. The tools over the top of it actually build Java code that goes off and executes. So that's the approaches we're going to take. We're going to take the elements we saw in a previous video. We're going to take the events that we're seeing here. We're going to put them together to make GUIs happen. And so go and look at the demos, the samples of code to see those things come together.